Dear God in heaven, as we see events fulfilling in the world, we watch all these things going on, we understand the seriousness of the times in which we live. Please show us the extent and seriousness of misogyny. We know that there is an end to the lightness and humour about misogyny, and that will come. So please show us the gravity of it. For us in the movement, for people in adventism and people in the world, we ask that you would grant eyesight that we may see. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so we're going to do a review today of contraception, abortion, and the Supreme Court. So just to give an outline of where we're going to go, if we have time, we will start with some background, which is behind me. We're going to talk about progress that was made in terms of abortion rights over history, so we'll look at the timeline. We're going to look at 2022, so earlier this year, and the Dobbs decision that was made and the impact of that. We will explore what the core issue is in the debate between both sides of the argument, and we'll try to simplify that argument down to its core issues. If we have time, we'll look at who's to blame in bringing us to the Dobbs decision and that event and that undoing. And we will also talk about the image of the beast, because we know the Sunday law is before us, and we need to recognise and understand the image of the beast and its relation to this issue specifically. So that's where I'm planning to head. So to begin with, we're just going to look at some of the beliefs and doctrines that we have already established in the movement well before we got to Dobbs. We had in 2018, as way back as that, been taught about two streams of information. And as that was mentioned this morning as well, the ULA and the Hidekel. One stream, if we're talking about Sunday law, because that's what we're talking about today, will cause people to accept the Sunday law, and the other stream would cause them to reject the Sunday law. So we just keep all these thoughts in our minds as we go through and look at the issue. We learned in 2019 that the Sunday law was not going to be about Sunday, it was going to be about gender inequality as opposed to Sunday. And we know that because of the Eden to Eden model. We know that because if we were to hold on to the Sunday Sabbath issue, we would be saying in effect that we're in the same dispensation as the 1888 period, and therefore we're not really recognising the time of the end and a new dispensation. So we've moved from that dispensation into this one. We have a new test, and that is gender inequality. Okay. As far back as well as 2018, we learned about external sources and their involvement in bringing messages to the world, and that our role would be to harvest. So we see the importance of external sources there. And as we know, we're in the period of agitation of the Sunday law at the moment. These external sources, we would expect to see some noise happening there, and that's what we're seeing. We had the Eden to Eden model that was laid out in 2019, so well before Dobbs, and that's, like I mentioned here, a key to understanding what the issues are today. Also shows us that before we get to Eden, we really need to have misogyny dealt with. That needs to be done. Radical feminism is an important tenet of our movement. We see that these two principles of radical feminism line up with our movement's prophetic message. We have the personal is political as an essential thing that we both hold, and the concept of patriarchy being the deepest, oldest, worst, and most fundamental form of discrimination that exists, bringing us back to it being the first crime in the world at Eden. So apart from other beliefs that radical feminists may or may not hold, these two are really fundamental to understanding our position and understanding the issue of abortion. So if we just hold those sort of in mind, all of these things help set us up for having the right perspective on this issue. Now we're going to look at the timeline. I'm just going to bring us through a bit of revision on the history. It's a very long timeline, so I've put it I've sliced it up so we can fit everything in there because my whiteboard's not that big. We're going to look at first, I'm just going to put on there the dates for the first and second wave of feminism. So we've got the first wave from 1848, that in black. So 1848 and around 1920. We mark that as the period of first wave feminism. Now, first wave feminism was about voting rights. We see suffragettes, but we also see some other things, the contraceptive issues coming up here as well. But primarily, first wave feminism is focused on voting rights. And we can see there that did not completely emancipate women, even though they got the right to vote, because slavery occurs in families in the home. And so that really didn't solve the whole issue. That just approached the voting problem so much. We have second wave feminism, which is where we really see big changes. So we've got 1963. And you might remember the feminine mystique that we just spoke about this morning. And 1989 is where it's believed to have ended there. So second wave here. And second wave feminism is where we see, we really see radical feminism making big, most of the major advancements that are made through radical feminists. Now in green, hopefully you can see the colours there. I've tried to mark in green the lifetime of two women that we're going to look at today. And so I've got two waymarks here because they were actually born very close to each other, and they also died very close in age in the same years. I'll write their names here. You may remember them. I'll put the names here in case you want to look them up. Margaret Sanger, and she lived from 1879 to 1966. And Katherine McCormick. She was born a few years earlier than Margaret Sanger, 1875, and she died just 1 year after. So they basically lived throughout the same time period. You can see that their lifespan involves a lot of the first wave time period, so they lived through that, and they were suffragettes in this time period. And then they continued through that intermediary period. They also lived just into the beginning of the second wave feminism. And what they did here was really important in setting up conditions right for the second wave feminism. So as soon as this feminine mystique book came out and was able to kick this off, a lot of work had been done prior to that by these two women. So that's their lifetimes. Now, both of them also lived, and I think that they almost throughout their whole life, they lived with Comstock laws. Comstock laws started here in 1873. And I'm going to write, Comstock. Laws. And it was about vice. Vice is the key word there. Comstock laws started here, carried through this time period, really affected their lives, created a lot of problems for this movement about birth control movement, which we'll speak about. Right through this period around here, we see it's the Comstock laws are starting to be undone, and then they sort of mark the end of the Comstock laws around the middle of the 1900s. We see it sort of coming to an end. So they really never knew a life without these Comstock laws, except right at the end. So that's the environment in which they were born into and which they lived. So just to remind us a little bit about the Comstock laws. Okay, so Anthony Comstock is the person who it's named after. And the first one here was called Section 211. It's considered to be the parent of all of the Comstock laws, which popped up all over the states across the United States. Anthony Comstock was very offended and upset about what he called vice, which was sexually immoral material. And into that category, he had put contraception, anything to do with contraception, as part of sexually immoral material. So laws were added over a period of time. And just to give an example of what kinds of laws there were laws against the selling or sharing of items that aid in contraception, and you could get up to 5 years of hard labour for that. There were laws in 23 states against publishing or advertising information about contraception. This is for married women, single women, and anybody who wanted to know about how not to get pregnant. That was illegal in 23 states to have that information published and advertised. In 11 states, it was illegal to possess instructions about how not to get pregnant. In 14 states, it was illegal to tell someone where they could find information about how not to get pregnant. And in 6 states, there's made a sort of like a miscellaneous term, any method whatever, if you assist anyone in any method whatever, which would lead to knowledge about how not to get pregnant, that was a crime. So this is the environment in which they found themselves. So a quote from, I think it's from Wikipedia, Margaret Sanger's lifetime. Sanger popularised the term birth control, and she opened the first birth control clinic in the United States and established organisations that evolved into the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. And we'll look at the waymarks in her, some of the main waymarks in her life. Just a little bit about her background as well. Her mother died at 49 years old of tuberculosis and cervical cancer. So she died young. And in that time of her life, she had had 18 pregnancies in 22 years. So she had many children. Not all of those pregnancies carried to full term, but there were many children. Obviously, it has affected her health quite a lot, and she wouldn't be an odd example. She wouldn't have been an outlier. There would have been many women like that. In 1913, Margaret Sanger is working in a clinic in the Lower East Side of New York. So that's 1913, and we'll just go to the Lower East Side. This is an important moment in Margaret Sanger's life, because when she witnesses what is going on in the poorer communities there, and women with these non-stop pregnancies, non-stop giving birth to children, the effect that it's having on their families, their economic well-being, and also the attempts of self-induced abortions. She had, in a particularly tragic case, thrown her bag in the corner and said, "I would never take another case until I had made it possible for working women in America to have the knowledge to control birth." Okay, so that was a point in time where she just made this vow to herself. She was going to make that her mission, to help prevent what she was witnessing and trying to just, she could, you know, the problem was so big, something really needed to be done. So in 1914, so the next year, that's where we see the beginning of the birth control movement under Sanger. And that mission of that was to prevent constant pregnancies and these self-induced abortions that were going on. So we're just talking about contraception at the moment, or even just giving people advice. We're not talking about abortion yet. But we know the environment in which they're living is considering this kind of discussion to be criminal in many places. So what happens then when she opens the first birth control clinic in 1960? She ends up going to jail. I'll read you a quote from Wikipedia about that as well. So on October 16th, 1916, Sanger opened a family planning and birth control clinic in Brownsville neighbourhood of Brooklyn, the first of its kind in the United States. 9 days after the clinic opened, she was arrested. Her bail was set at $500 and she went back home. But Sanger continued seeing some women in the clinic until police came a second time. Sanger was convicted. The trial judge held that women, even married women, that's my, my comment, didn't have the right to copulate with any feeling of security that there would be no resulting conception. They don't have the right to copulate with any security that there's not going to be a conception that results. So Sanger was offered a more lenient sentence if she promised not to break the law again, but she replied, "I cannot respect the law as it exists today." So for this, she was sentenced to 30 days in a workhouse. As a side point too, when I was reading this up, her sister was also convicted and also sent to prison as well. And the sister went on a hunger strike, and she was one of the first of those women that were force-fed in the United States. Force feeding was if somebody was doing a hunger strike, and they would hold the woman down, put a rubber tube down their throat, down into their stomach, and pour things in there, and it would make the woman throw up or be sick or traumatize them, kind of like almost like torture. So this sister of Margaret Sanger was the first woman to go through this experience for this cause. Just mentioning that because it just shows, as we go through, how much cost there was to gain these rights over this period of time, how hard people fought and what they suffered in the cause. So 1817 is the next, 1917. We're going to introduce Katherine McCormick here. So a little bit of background on Katherine McCormick. When she was growing up, her family home was one of the stops along the Underground Railroad. That was from her childhood, so that's her background. She was a suffragist through this time period as well. She wanted to become a doctor. She actually went to MIT and studied biology there. She wasn't the very first person to go through. I think she was the second, but I think the one that had been sometime earlier. So she was probably the only woman there at the time, if not a very rare woman amongst the men. In the laboratory, they would make her, they had a rule where she would have to wear a hat, and the hat had feathers. And she protested against the university against this rule, which was unsafe in the lab to keep making women wear hats. There's all kinds of things about her. So you could just see that she was a feminist right from the get-go. And so that was her life at MIT. She did graduate. The year she graduated, she got married. And so she didn't become a doctor, but she did get married to an heir from the McCormick family fortune. And she was married to him for a long time, but it was only 2 years after they got married where her husband was institutionalized for mental condition. He was actually too dangerous to be with. So they didn't live together. He was looked after 24 hours a day by carers, and she didn't see him very much, certainly not for a long time, and then just a little bit later on in life. So, but this is how she had access to money, because she married this wealthy man. So she had access to some money, not the full inheritance yet, but she did have money. And so she was able to bring money into this cause. So we see now in 1917, this is the year where Margaret Sanger and Katherine McCormick actually meet for the first time. And there, I'll just put a dollar sign there to indicate that now the movement has got some money coming in. 1918 is the end of World War I. And men are coming back from war with STDs. So where all of this was considered vice, any discussion of sexual health was frowned upon. Now it becomes an issue where men in power now consider this to be legitimate discussion on health, and so it makes a better environment where the women can now start dealing with the birth control issue a little bit with less resistance and oppression. So I just marked there, that's the men with STDs. Oh, yeah. All right, so that's where we are with that one. And just comparing this, the fact that Margaret Sanger's mother, with all her pregnancies in 22 years and 18 pregnancies, where that was not valued as an important issue. Men with gonorrhea coming back from World War I was considered to be fairly illegitimate. So you can just see the contrast there and the double standards. So in early 1920s, they opened up the New York Birth Control Research Institution. Birth Control Research Institution. So that allows them now to run a research institution, and the women that come there are called research subjects, and they can now look at this as a health issue. And what was invented at around that time was something called a diaphragm. So that would prevent conception. It was a device you could insert into the woman's vagina, and it would cover the cervix, and then prevent sperm from entering there. So that was a barrier, a bit like a condom, but a woman would use it. And this was something that was potentially going to protect a lot of women from all of these issues that they're having with too many babies and all these pregnancies and self-induced abortions. So this was something that was quite important. But it was illegal to import contraceptive devices into the United States still. So this presented a problem. But Katherine McCormick wasn't just supplying money now she's getting actually active as well in smuggling in, because she had a privileged position being a wealthy woman that could manage to get away with doing this. So what she did was, and this is from, she started this in 1922. And she would start smuggling the diaphragms in. So you may remember that she went to Geneva, she went to her family chateau outside Geneva. She was preparing to import these diaphragms into the United States. She visited cities, Rome and Paris, and these are cities where they were manufacturing diaphragms. So, and she could also disguise this as shopping spree. She went to these manufacturers, and because she was multilingual and she also had this qualification in biology, and she was clearly wealthy, I guess, she could pose as a researcher and purchase bulk diaphragms. So she was buying hundreds of these at a time. And then she had seamstresses unpick the inner linings of fancy gowns and put them all in there and then stitch it back up. And in fact, on her first trip, she had 8 steamer trunks full of these coats and garments full of diaphragms hidden inside. That was all shipped across the Atlantic. When it arrives there, nobody inspected her luggage, and she was able to sneak them through. So it was successful. I think in her first trip, she imported more than 1,000. So she was really quite brave, and also very effective at getting these in and getting these to the women that needed them. So she did this again and again every year, but she finished in 1925 because there was an emergency in her family life things going on. There was other problems that she had to attend to, so that interrupted this, but she managed to import more. She started hiding them in other items as well. Christmas presents she'd have wrapped up, and beauty cases and things like that were full of them. So she started to get creative. She couldn't, she could fit so many into the coats and garments, but she could bring in even more if she started hiding them in other things. So she upped it and upped it, but eventually that had to stop. So that period of time goes until 1925. Okay. Now, I'm going to skip a little bit of time now. We're going to jump ahead now to 1942. So by the time we get to 1942, there's been progress on this front. So across the United States, there's now 400 birth control clinics, and that's when the organisation changes its name to Planned Parenthood. So that's where you would mark where that name change happened. But 400 birth control clinics across the United States. Okay, and during this time, there's been ongoing battles between, and in different states, it would depend, between the Comstock laws and these women trying to set up birth control clinics. Women have been arrested, imprisoned, they've been force-fed due to these laws or these legal battles, but gradually these Comstock laws are slowly being undone for being unconstitutional. And this is just over handing out information for women about how not to get pregnant. So it's hard to believe that such a world existed not that long ago. To me, it's quite a shock that it was that bad so recently. All right, so next we have 1945. We normally think of the end of World War II, but here we have Katherine McCormick's husband died that year, and so then she inherits the whole fortune now and is completely in control of the money. So she comes into a lot of money here. More money, and she's got a lot of money, and rather than being frivolous and using it all on herself, she thinks of others, and she's thinking of women, poorer women across the country who need help, and so she puts that money to good use. It's then 1953 when she meets Gregory Pincus. In fact, it's joined. It's Margaret Sanger introduces Katherine McCormick to this man who is trying to develop a contraceptive pill, something hormonal that would help. So they meet in 1953. So just marking their pill research. In fact, I'll read you the quote. He did start a little earlier on his own, but he needed help. In 1953, McCormick met Gregory Pincus through Margaret Sanger. Pincus had been working on developing a hormonal birth control method since 1951. The donations started at $100,000 a year and later increased to $150,000 to $180,000 a year up until her death in 1967. In sum, McCormick had provided $2 million, which is worth about $20 million in today's terms, of her own money for the development of the oral contraceptive pill. Pincus would often say that he could never have done it without Sanger, McCormick, and another man called John Rock, who was a gynecologist that also helped. So we see her over a period of, it's actually 14 years. She donated every year. Where will I mark that through till when she died. So I'll mark it to there from when she started funding this until when she died here. $2 million. I think anybody who pays $100,000 a year for something today, that's a lot of money, but back then you can just imagine how big that kind of a donation would be. So yeah, $2 million over this period of time towards the research until she died. So right up until her death, she was still supporting this. During this time, we'll see that there was actually, the pill was done by here, I'll mark it now. It's 1957 when the pill was actually given FDA approval. I'll just put a tick there for FDA approval, and that's where we say the pill, known as the pill. It's now on the scene as we see second wave approaching. A couple of comments about that. So she keeps funding even beyond this time period because they continue to develop further research and improve the pill. So the money keeps coming in for the pill. And also at this point here, when they give it FDA approval, it's for menstrual disorders. It's not for contraception. And I don't think contraception is even mentioned as a side effect or a indication or anything like that that goes with the product. It's not mentioned until later that this contraceptive may be like a side effect of this pill. So that's an interesting point to say there as well. People are still not ready for allowing contraception outrightly. Okay, now we get to, so we've got the beginning of the second wave. We've got the feminine mystique comes out. We see women rising up and wanting equality. And 1965 is when we have the court case Griswold versus Connecticut. Griswold versus Connecticut. That's a Supreme Court case. So it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, started in Connecticut and worked its way up there. And it eventually ruled that it was unconstitutional for governments to prohibit married couples from using birth controls. We're just talking about married couples at the moment, but now it's unconstitutional for the government to prohibit married couples from using birth control. So that was a major undoing of all of this Comstock laws and everything like that had been in play here. So this is a landmark ruling where we really see a huge change. So that's the right to contraception first introduced, you know, just as a basic human right. Okay, I'll put a dot there. I'll mark the court cases like that so they're easy to identify. So that was a huge shift. Shortly after that, both Margaret Sanger and Katherine McCormick died 1 year apart from each other, but they've done their work. They've set everything up for the second wave. So the second wave can go now. It's quite empowered by this. It really helps emancipate women to be able to seek equality, to be able to just use contraception. So the extension of contraceptive rights to unmarried couples was later as well, just around just the early 70s. We also see that extended. So it's took a fair bit of time actually for that to be extended to unmarried couples. Okay, so I'm going to go to Roe v. Wade now, 1973. Okay, very famous one. That one is where abortion was legalised across the United States. So an extension of the right to contraception, now it's the right to abortion. It would be unconstitutional for a state to prevent a woman from being able to access an abortion. There were guidelines, you know, what we call it, like boundaries to that. One of the boundaries was that still a woman would have to the husband would also have to consent for this to happen. So she would have to notify him prior to undergoing the procedure, unless there were certain exceptions. So we see that being, some progress. So I'll just write there a right to an abortion. Right to an abortion, and then it's not until 1992 that this issue about notifying the husband or the man is brought up. So that's 1992 in Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Call it spousal notice is no longer required in that one. Just see if there's any other comments you want to make about that one. Yeah, that one there recognised that spousal notice gave the husband too much power to stop her or to hurt her over her decision. So this spousal notice was invalidated there. So we see some more progress. And now I'm going to take us to 2022. Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health. That's here. Okay, we know what the ruling of that was, and in particular, we want to take note that it's this. I don't know whether to do it in red or not. I'll just do it in black. I'll cross it out, do like that. This decision here has now invalidated this, and it's Planned Parenthood, I think, is the other one. Yeah, these two here have now been undone by this one here. So we've wound it back, and it's now not considered to be unconstitutional for a state to restrict women's rights to abortion and that kind of thing. So now states are implementing their own laws without the threat of the federal government coming in. So this is a fundamental bedrock of emancipation for women that's been dismantled, like already been dismantled this year. So it's a significant event that I'm sure we all realise anyway, but just see that that's probably not the end of it anyway, because at least one Supreme Court judge is seeking to go even further, and that's Clarence Thomas, who said openly that he's coming after more laws using the similar underlying arguments as an excuse to attack them all. So quoting Clarence Thomas, he said, "In future cases, we should reconsider all of this court's substantive due process precedents, including Griswold, Lawrence and Obergefell. We have a duty to correct the error established in those precedents." Okay, so he wants to correct the error that were established in those precedents. So we had mention of Griswold, which is this one, which he wants to, in his words, reconsider and to correct the error. And also Griswold and Lawrence, Lawrence and Obergefell. So I'll just describe them as well quickly. And we'll mark them here as 1998. And that one here is Lawrence versus Texas. And this one was about sodomy rules. And then the other one, which was Obergefell 2015, we're more familiar with. And this was gay marriage. Okay, so the success of this one now he's pointing back to this one and to this one and to this one as the ones lined up in his sights. And you can see what is the theme with all of these. We can see the theme is gender, can't we? Whether that be women's reproductive rights, or women's equality, or LGBT, and we know that that issue is an extension of women's equality. That's deeply connected and all to do with gender. So it's quite big what we saw here. And so just reminding us as well that it was 3 years ago that we learned that the Sunday law was not going to be about Sunday, it was going to be about gender equality. So we've known in advance to expect this. And now we're watching it to be fulfilled in like real time as we're living through it. A fulfillment of what we were expecting to see is actually happening. And it's quite fearful really to see this going on, watching the news and seeing these things appearing on our screens, telling us exactly what we kind of were expecting. So one important thing that this history shows us is how abortion, we needed to know the history of the abortion rights, how it developed. We need to see that abortion rights have arisen out of contraceptive rights. So it's an extension of contraceptive rights. It's not a separate issue, they're connected deeply. The people who dissented over the Dobbs decision recognised this connection between contraceptive rights leading to abortion rights and how one is an extension of the other. They said the right that Roe and Casey recognised does not stand alone. This abortion right doesn't stand alone. To the contrary, the court has linked it for decades to other settled freedoms involving bodily integrity, familial relationships and procreation. Most obviously, the right to terminate a pregnancy arose straight out of the right to purchase and use contraception. Because the reason they're linked is because as good as contraception is, it doesn't always work. And so there has always been a plan B. That plan B may have been a horrible plan B, but it was still a plan B, as Margaret Sanger knew when she worked on the Lower East Side and saw that playing out there. There has always been a plan B, and this is plan B here now, as we see it, when it was legalised and made more safe for women. So women who felt that they had little choice had been attempting to self-induce abortions. And so they've always been linked, these two issues. It's not a new phenomenon that we see there. Okay, did anybody have any questions about the timeline specifically? I'll have general questions at the end, but is everything clear on all those things I've mentioned in the timeline? Okay, let's move on to now we've done the history. So we've talked about how the progress was made in terms of abortion rights, and we've looked at how 2022 has affected that. Now we're going to just look at some of the arguments that come up and what Elder Tess had done in these studies. She said she's not going to go into all of each little argument like that, but she was going to give a broad perspective on it and not go into all those little arguments. But what she did say about it was that there was going to be a right approach and a wrong approach to this issue. I'll do green and red. Right and wrong. Right. So first issue that people that she addressed was the the idea or the concept of the sanctity of life. What she talked about was how even in Adventism, she gave an example of a woman being told that when she was going to get married, she would, if there was any sperm in her mouth, she should swallow it because it's holy sperm. It's sanctified sperm or something like that. And identifying that idea was in Adventism and connecting that to the same idea which we see in Protestantism and Catholicism, the sanctity of life argument that they hold as well. So linking Adventism to Protestantism and Catholicism, and then on to also connecting it to Aristotle, so not even Christianity. Outside of Christianity, we see the same idea in Aristotle. And as many of us know, what Aristotle has written about women and men and sperm, and the woman being like a pot of dirt where the seed would be planted. The sperm actually is where all the life is, and the woman just is the dirt or the ground where you would put that in, and this magical sperm would then sprout up, and all of that life actually came from the man and not from the woman. It's almost like the woman is just an incubator for this thing. So this idea, the fact that it was in even outside of Christianity and in all these different groups, shows that it's a cultural argument. It doesn't need Christianity. It's something that comes underneath. It's sort of almost deeper than religion itself, this idea of holy sperm. So I'll just jot up those couple of notes. Sanctity of life. Oh, we can put in brackets there, holy sperm. As this idea. And what she identified by making those connections is that this argument here is cultural. It's a cultural approach to the issue. I will quote her because this is a quotable quote, I think, and you know, I couldn't say it better myself. She said, "We could argue about when life begins, when cells that are alive and other cells that are alive make more cells that are alive. At what point in that early construction of a shell does it have human rights superseding that of a woman?" So, yeah, I just thought that was really well put. So that's the sanctity of life kind of angle, and arguing then that is really a cultural mindset that is not, it's not Adventist, it's not Protestant or Catholic, it's actually underneath all of those things and deeper than that. And what the issue actually, even with Catholicism, what it really boils down to is the role of women in culture. You can see that they connect abortion, they also have doctrines on contraception and all of these things. It's all got to do with the role of women in culture. That's really where the core of the issue is, on this side. So I put that in the box to highlight that this is really the foundation. The role of women in culture. And then out of that, you get this. And another one that you get out of this as well is all the arguments that have to do with why Plan A failed. And as well, why Plan A failed. For example, was it rape? Was it incest? Was the mother's life at stake? Is it because the pill failed? Is it because she was uneducated about sex? Was she drunk and forgot? All of these things have got to do with the issue of why Plan A failed. And that's not the core of the issue, because what they're arguing here is, you know, what role did the woman play in this? And is she in line with cultural expectations of the role of a woman or not? So this then again becomes a distraction from the main core of the issue here, which is the role of the woman in culture. So I'm going to say, just to summarise in my own words what I've understood from Elder Tessa's presentation, that's my slant on it anyway, is that these are cultural arguments on this side. Now, we know that we're directed by prophetic arguments, don't we? And we shift our lives and our opinions in line with prophecy. We don't twist it around and try to make prophecy suit us. So what does prophecy say? That's a prophetic approach. Number one, we're looking at abortion rights. What we see here happening in society is that human rights are not being applied consistently, and we know that our methodology would always direct us to apply things consistently. We have to be consistent across different arguments, different issues with our approach. So when we're looking at bodily autonomy, well, I'll just write here, we have to, maybe I'll do bodily autonomy. And I'll just write be consistent. For example, in every other situation and issue, universal human rights recognises the autonomy of the body, but not with this issue. And for example, what she gave was if a child needed a kidney, and we all know and we all would agree that it would not be right for somebody to force us down, hold us down, do surgery, remove our kidney and give it to that child, because we have the right to our bodily integrity. So if we're going to use a consistency, we need to see that this same principle would apply in this case as well for abortion. So that's one point. Now, what it really boils down to, though, and I'm going to say is the core issue on this side, is that it's got to do with economic and social equality. Right. So now how we got to economic and social equality is based on prophetic message, and we talked about that at the beginning, all the reasons why we, and they're not all the reasons, but some of the reasons why we have, why we stand for women's equality. And when we look at the abortion issue, we'll just look at some of the reasons, some of the things that abortion affects in terms of women's economic and social equality. So if we look at who's actually having abortions, the statistics on who's having them, half of them are below the poverty line. 3/4 of them struggle to pay for food, housing and transport. More than 25% of them, so more than 1/4 of them, are the only adult in the household, and there are children in the household. So there's a really large portion of people who are accessing abortions are the poorest in the community. What happens when abortion is denied to women? They are around 4 times more likely to be below the poverty line and descending from that point onwards. So it's there is a very strong connection with the economic well-being and social well-being of women with access to this right. It's so strong a connection that you can't deny that exists. So if this is our core argument for this issue, we can see which side of the argument it would put us on, as we believe in equality. So outflowing from that, based on economic and social equality, we can see that this argument would then outflow from that, because their women's rights for bodily autonomy based on their equality would be equal with other people's rights for their bodily integrity. And another, just way that it can be expressed is it's got to do with our approach. It should not be why Plan A failed, but that it does. So it's a fact that Plan A fails. It fails sometimes, that's a fact. That's not really a debatable issue. The point is, when it fails, what is done about that? Because now the woman's economic and social equality is at risk. So put that at risk there. The woman is now at risk, and that issue needs to be addressed. Okay, so that's my interpretation of what Elder Tess said in that study. Okay, good, we've got time, so we'll keep going on with how did we get here. So what Elder Tess had posed is, like, when we're looking at the Dobbs decision, and we're here and people in the movement and around the world are horrified at this decision, and who's actually getting the blame and who deserves to be blamed for this. Number one question, is it old white Christian men that we blame for this? Well, addressing it with a quote that is from a woman that went to the protests, not protests, but went to the Supreme Court at the time of this decision, was interviewed. Excuse me. So what she said, we were expecting the decision to come down, and it did come down, and we're very happy with the decision. So I didn't want to be involved at the beginning because I'm not a conservative. So I was like, how could I go with a bunch of Republicans, white dudes? I don't feel comfortable doing that. But I realised it was much more than that. It's made up of women. It's made up of people of colour. It's made up of atheists, LGBTQ, Democrats. There's Democrats for life. It's the pro-life community. So when this event happens and you see media blaming old white Christian men, it's lazy reporting and cowardly, in fact, and not accurate. And even if we just looked at the Supreme Court ruling and which justices were responsible for that, we have Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett and Clarence Thomas. And if you just look at those three, you see they're not old white Christian men who are responsible. So that was number one, old white Christian men. Is that how we got here? No, that would not be a complete picture of how we got here. Secondly, the second thing to blame is romanticised misogyny. Society's complete lack of will to fight for gender equality. How the very fact that people are so blind to the romanticising of misogyny in Hollywood and media, just as in Gone with the Wind, where slavery was romanticised. So we see misogyny romanticised in the same way today, and people are blind to that. The two articles, The Future Isn't Female Anymore and Feminism Made a Faustian Bargain with Celebrity Culture, are two articles that should be read and reread and really well understood in understanding how we got here to this point and who's to blame. And it's not blaming old white Christian men or the Republican Party. So that's an important point to remember as well. And if you're looking for those articles, you can go to the media broadcast channel on WhatsApp, and you would find it actually pretty easy to find there because it was one of the latest ones that was posted there, if you want to look them up again and read them today. So old white Christian men, not exactly, not just them. Romanticised misogyny, yes. And the third one, the cultural belief in holy sperm. Because it's not just religions that think this way. You find atheists believing the same thing without religion. It's because it's embedded, like I said, in culture and doesn't need religion. For example, there's a quote from Kelsey Hazard, who was from the Secular Pro-Life Organisation. And I'll read that quote. I am an atheist, a 29-year-old woman, well-educated at secular institutions. I lean liberal on many issues, including same-sex marriage and climate change. I am also a dedicated pro-life activist, working to make abortion unthinkable. The abortion industry would have you believe that people like me don't exist. They would have you believe that pro-life movements is almost exclusively old white men, with a few pill-clutching church ladies thrown in. This characterisation is insulting to both young and old. So even she is seeing that the media is portraying the pro-life movement incorrectly and too narrowly, not seeing the scale of the issue. She herself is holding to this holy sperm idea without any religion. It's cultural, and just like we could see the idea of inherent biological differences, we see that in atheism, we see that in religion, same way we see this idea of holy sperm is also in atheism, and it's also in religion. It's cultural. Both of those ideas are cultural, not religious ideas. Deeper than that, which is why it's so hard to eradicate. Okay, so what we're going to do now is look at the article that was written in 2014 in Time magazine and another article that was written in 2022, you might remember, about the 2014 being the best year for women. We'll have a look at that and just compare how the two sides played out in that argument. So I'll keep this for later, maybe, about this one. So before we talk about those articles, we're going to put them into context on the timeline. So we have the line of the 144,000, and we're not going to fill in all the dates, but that's the line there. Then we have the line of the priests, Levites, and Nethinims. We've got 2014 here, which also, let me just back that up a little. Lines up with that one here, 2014. So that's priests here and Nethinims there. What we see here about these waymarks, we're going to have the middle waymark is always Sunday law 1. So 1, 2, 3, and then there's going to be 1 here. So we'll put that like that. Stick on here so it looks clearer. Okay, so we're going to see 1, 2, 3, 4 Sunday laws, and this is the first Sunday law out of those 4. Okay. So pretty significant in terms of being the first one in the series as like a prototype. This one here, this 2014, the same year, for this group is the time of the end for Nethinims. Okay, so that to them was their time of the end, and it's also the first Sunday law. And the issue we know, as we know, is gender. Okay, so just make sure I've pointed all those points out. Here, as we spoke about at the beginning, the external sources and the fact that we knew we would not be harvesting until up the end here. The voices that are supposed to be speaking to this group that have the external sources as their voices. So at this point, you should be hearing through this period a broadcast about what is going on. And what do you hear them saying in 2014? Well, I'll leave that broadcast picture in there, and I'll draw a picture of Time magazine. It's Time of the End, and it's Time magazine. They call it the best year for women. Okay, so I think we can all see that that's problematic for that to be the messaging at the time. So let's have a look at that article a little bit. So the quote that's from it is, "Since the dinosaurs roamed, since the pyramids were built, since the locomotive was invented, there has never been a better year for women than 2014. And just having looked at all that history to do with the second wave feminism and all this rights that have gone on in that other period of history, it's quite an outstanding statement to think that this was actually the best year since those, you know, the most recent, the locomotive being invented. This is the best year for women, when in fact it was not." So what the author then is doing, because now we're at the Dobbs decision, so let's put that, let's just say, we're going to mark the Sunday law. So let's say this is 2022 here. So now the person is here, because this is, you know, these are their voices, the external sources. So I'll put it there. So there's an article here and an article here. But we'll look at what she says. So she's saying that there's a problem now. She's looking, she's standing here, the Dobbs decision has just happened. Now she's looking back at this article and critiquing it. So the arguments are, let me read it out. "I listed reasons that seemed important at the time, but look superficial in retrospect. From the success of Frozen, a handful of new women CEOs Beyonce at the MTV. Dancing in front of the word feminist at the MTV's Video Music Awards. While online feminists interrogated celebrities about whether they called themselves feminists and what empowered them, most conservatives were amassing the raw power to pass trigger laws in 13 states. While progressive nonprofits through galas celebrating female inspiration, brands that spent millions on body positive ad campaigns. Body positive with brands. And celebrities partnered with NGOs to provide women's empowerment. So you see the NGOs with celebrities. While all this is going on, the fight to protect reproductive rights got too little funding and attention. So the neglect, the protection of abortion rights. So all of this is coming out of that year 2014. While the left tallied the number of women nominated for Oscars, and which top grossing movies passed the Bechdel test, savvy Republican operatives were carefully building a pipeline of conservative judges. With immaculate resumes in anticipation of future Supreme Court vacancies. So 2014, the year I dubbed as the best ever for women, was also the year in which Republicans won the Senate, putting McConnell in position to block Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland to the High Court. Oh, we'll say blocks Garland. But that 2014 is when he was put in position to do that. But overall, the fall of Roe signifies that liberal feminists were outmaneuvered. So I'm going to draw a line here now, and we're going to divide this into two groups. This is liberal feminists. On this side. Liberal feminists were outmaneuvered by focusing on empowerment and losing sight of the nuts and bolts of political mechanics. They failed to recognise what McConnell and his allies have known all along: only power is power. Some call this thinking girl boss feminism, others tie it to white feminism, others would be wrong. So you see here, one group is acting like the person was political, the other acting like it's not. I will also add in here another thing which is not mentioned there, Gamergate 2014. And I think this morning, as we were reminded, we also had Elliot Rogers' attack as well in 2014. Supposedly the best year for women. So when we're looking at who to blame, what we kind of have to keep in mind is the failures on the left. So the way I like to sort of visualise this, what she's saying here, what Elder Tess is saying here, is that we have the time of the end, 1989 is the time of the end, and this is going to be you know, everybody's heading over to Sunday law, and we have a good stream and a bad stream, and we have two competing parties in the world. So 1989. Okay, we've got X amount of years to get to Sunday law, and it's almost as if you've got the left wing here and the right wing also running side by side with two competing visions for what the world should look like. What the author of this article is now saying with arguments here in this other article, I've got this other one, time. The argument is there's 61% here that would have supported a woman's right to abortion and 37% on the other side. And how it's unfair that there's more of these than these. So how come the smaller group is getting their way? The point being that the 37% acted like the person was political, and the 61% was talking about Beyonce and lean in and throwing away the radical feminist idea against beauty standards, but rather embracing them. The 61% have had years of failure leading up until Dobbs here. And the 37% end up deciding. And this argument that the author's making here that the majority should get their way is hypocritical anyway, because if you brought race to the issue, they wouldn't argue that. If they were a minority against racial segregation, they wouldn't say that the majority should get their way. The principle is the matter, is the point. So it's a lame argument. And our elder says there was pathetic arguments from sore losers, and it's too late now. You know, too much has happened here in this time period, and now it's too late because this side has basically failed and let the issue down. So we know that we are a line of success because we have the model of failure, success. And we know that we're a line of success. But the abolitionists of this time are failing, and that's why we end up coming to the second advent. So if it was in the Millerite time period and the abolitionists had been like this, as failures as much as this, then Christ would have come, because the Sunday law would come to be. So because the abolitionists of our day are failing, it's bringing us to this climactic point. So they're failing, even though our movement is a success. So we've got to pay attention to this. Is Time magazine, not Fox, that was broadcasting this message. So we know, we are aware that there are problems on the left wing, and this highlights that. So we're really not seeing a huge, it's not that the Republican Party or the right wing are much stronger than they were in Millerite times. It's that the left are weaker than they were in Millerite times. It's this side that's failure is the problem, not so much what we expected these to do anyway. There's really no surprise here. Yeah, so that's that point there. And what we're going to do now is just talk about the image of the beast. Just rub this off again. So we know if we're heading to Sunday law that the image of the beast is important. And so we need to bring that into the story as well. We've got this timeline here. I was just going to point out, as we discussed, we've got Sunday law here. And this waymark here is was our Paniums 2021. We had Well, let me draw it up so it's clear that these are the major waymarks here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we had here 2019 and 2021. And we know here, this is the agitation. Warnings. We should be hearing and seeing an agitation, which we are. And so when we look at the image of the beast, Ellen White had advised us, if we want to understand the image of the beast, we first need to study the beast. So if we're going to look at beast, and let's just say, put beast here. The UN Commissioner had been to see Pope Francis and said that we agreed on everything except women's reproductive rights and LGBT. I'll put reproductive rights, that's shorthand, and LGBT. And at the same time, we can see Adventism. Because they're looking at Sunday law being Sunday, they are not seeing that they're not actually seeing the United States speaking as a dragon. So you see the this prophet there speaking like that. We see them also with the women, reproductive rights and LGBT issues, having issues there, and you could revise the ones about Ted Wilson and the aberrations if you want to look more into that. But we see there's issues there with that. So we've got Adventism here, we've got the beast, we've got the false prophet who's already starting to speak like a beast. And then we have, let's put the dragon, take that away, but let's make a list. The dragon. And what we see going on there, for one example, the elder telescope was women in Pakistan giving themselves abortions. And that's not something that they're directed through Islam to do. It's not because of their religion. The reason they're giving themselves abortions is because of what their husbands will do to them if they give birth to another girl. So this is cultural, not Islam. So just say, for example, women in Pakistan. But it's not hard to find lots of examples of women's reproductive rights and LGBT issues in many non-Christian countries. You can see that quite easily looking around the world. So we see that we can see it's cultural because it's running through all of these groups. But in contrast, our movement we have our prophetic model, which teaches us and gives us the straight path. We know that our message is based on equality. And we got that through the prophetic message. And we saw the abortion, the link that abortion has to economic and social equality. So we can see where belief in equality would lead you, what stance it would guide you to in the issue of abortion. We know that we stand with radical feminism because they hold the Eden to Eden model and they believe that personal is political just like we do. And we know that radical feminists, what their stance is on abortion. We have the understanding about emancipation. We know line upon line about slavery. We have the prophetic message to teach us that. We know that emancipation depends upon reproductive rights. So we can see the effect that this would have on our stance on abortion. And contraception, as we've discussed today, we know the link that Plan A has when it fails and how that relates to abortion and how there's such a strong connection between those two. If you start threatening this one, you can see that then it starts to become a problem moving backwards as well, undoing that progress that was made. So we're in the agitation of the Sunday Law. The Dobbs decision, as we can see, is aligned and totally in agreement with what the Beast would like. Adventism is aligned with the wrong faction of the Supreme Court, which is a worry, and they're not seeing what the test is because of their misunderstanding of prophecy. So they're in danger, and we can just see that this is a cultural issue because when we bring in non-Christian countries here, we can see that they don't need religion to be failing the Sunday Law test. So how it relates to us, so movement members, if we look at the Dobbs decision and think that we're fine because we didn't like the Dobbs decision, but we need to be careful because what we actually need to compare ourselves to is the faction of, which I've rubbed out, that left wing, which was all in blue here before, that treated gender issues lightly and were continually surprised, taken off guard, not treating the personal as political. All of those failures, if we can see that in ourselves, then that's a problem we need to deal with. So we need to always bring our messages back to ourselves as well and make sure that we are on the right side. So it's easy to always say everyone else is bad and we're good, but we just need to be careful to make sure that we take this seriously with the gravity that it deserves. So on that point, I will finish up and we will close in prayer and then I'll open it up to questions. So if you'll kneel. Dear God in heaven, we can see fulfilling before our eyes things that we've expected for 30 years and more. And we see the Dobbs ruling and we see other examples happening in the world at the moment and the gravity of these things that are going on. We want to stand with your kingdom and we ask that you would guide us as we try to vote for the right kingdom with our behaviour. We ask you to help the people in the world whose messengers are failing them. Please open their eyes and help them to see that they may also vote with their behaviour and stand with your kingdom. We pray for our movement's workers who have frustrations with dealing with people who have treat the issues lightly, who resist or fight the truth or the messages, especially as it impacts people's personal lives and families. We pray for the movement's workers to have endurance and that they would see the fruit wherever it may be, and that you would give them courage and endurance, and especially the women who have to also deal with deep-set misogyny which still exists in us as we try to eradicate that. We pray for them especially to have courage and to keep fighting strong for this important, very, very important issue. So we thank you for teaching us through the prophetic message and bringing us to a position where we know what is right and what is wrong and that we may be on the right stream. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.